Hello and welcome to the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum's Fall Lecture Series. Uh, just a few housekeeping issues. This is an interactive video, so please hold your questions until the end. Until then, if you'll please mute your microphones and then unmute them then, and we will proceed with your questions interactively. Today's presentation is from Greg Ketchen. Greg is a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain living on Cape Cod. He's a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum located in Barnstable's Old Customs House and currently serves as its president. Before moving to the Cape 10 years ago, Greg's career included providing support to Massachusetts's commercial ports as a development consultant, heading operations at the New England Aquarium, and filling a wide variety of Coast Guard jobs. These included performing duties as the head of the service's search and rescue policies, completing an assignment as deputy commander and chief oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, serving on the faculty of the Coast Guard Academy, and commanding Group Boston, at a NATO station in Italy. He's completed graduate studies in both physical oceanography and business administration. Please join in welcoming Greg. Greg?
Okay, going to put on sound and good. Ready to start, I guess, if it looks good from your end.
Yes, it does.
Okay, we start. The technology is always amazing when it works. It still amazes me that although using Zoom a lot, I think with being, we all become very familiar with it. It's still amazing to be sitting here in my home office on Cape Cod and speaking to a crowd from, essentially could be from all over the country. Obviously tonight, mostly from Pennsylvania and at least a couple from Massachusetts. The topic tonight was another steel story about Coast Guard breakers, but as a disclaimer, I should point out that I'm not a structural engineer, naval architect, or metallurgist. I know something about steel, but that's not what the major emphasis is going to be tonight. It's going to be the evolution of icebreakers and how steels and other materials were used to develop icebreakers. But hopefully I can provide some interesting anecdotes that would be of value. I feel fortunate to have served in the Coast Guard for 31 years in a variety of jobs. It was a challenging and wonderful experience. Certainly not particularly unique for a Coast Guard officer, but I think by just using this as an example, which I'll do in a second, of what I have done, gives you an idea of the diversity of missions and activities the Coast Guard has. It's a montage of some of my experience and a small sampling of them. If you can see in the lower left-hand corner, I spent some time on a medium endurance cutter. It's a 210-foot cutter doing fisheries patrols offshore, search and rescue activities, working with the Navy. The upper left-hand corner is a station I had. It's a NATO station I had in Lampedusa, Italy, that was serving the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. The upper right-hand corner was some of the glacier surveys I was involved in on the west coast of Greenland, which I'll show a little more in a second. The lower right is some of the fun times, and actually most of them were fun, doing schooner patrols, a lot of search and rescue, safety activities, that sort of thing related to my time up in Maine. And the middle just shows my experience in Boston, spent 5 years there in a variety of jobs, as Jim just pointed out, including in charge of the search and rescue policy program at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, and also small boat station staffing studies. This just shows a quick other thing tying into the ice aspect of what I have done. I've had a chance to serve on icebreakers in the Great Lakes, in the Arctic, and on the coast of New England, various types of icebreakers, and I'll show you those in a second. Also did surveys. Part of my one of my jobs was as a staff oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, and that involved doing glacier surveys on the west coast of Greenland. So I spent quite a bit of time in the Arctic. My other than my time in the Coast Guard, my graduate work was in science, master of science in physical oceanography. So that's basically studying currents, actions of tides, coastal processes, that sort of stuff. But I've had a passionate interest in history since childhood, frankly. And now in the last few years, most of that's been focused toward Coast Guard history. I am, as Jim pointed out, a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, which is on Cape Cod. And let me advance to that in a second. This is the building, this is a centerpiece of our campus. It's a 1856 customs house, and it was an old post office for a while too. Customs on the second floor. I put a picture of this here primarily to point out that it's a cast iron building. It was built in 1856, first fireproof building on Cape Cod. Essentially, the entire structure of the building is cast iron, then covered with brick on the inside and the outside. I'd be very curious. I'm quite certain that the it was cast in Pennsylvania somewhere. We haven't determined where yet. This was the Department of Treasury through an architect named Ami Young in the 1840s and 1850s, designed the building and built, a dozen and a half of these, maybe even 24 of these around the country, all pretty much the same, although some were covered in brick, some were covered in granite and other materials. But certainly if your museum has any access to understanding where this was done by the federal government, it'd be interesting just to find out where the building was actually manufactured. It came in by rail, we're quite certain, to Boston, and was brought down to the Cape on a boat, since there wasn't rail traffic on the Cape at that point. The reason that we're here, we're one of 2 freestanding museums in the country. There's another one in called Coast Guard Museum Northwest in Seattle. And the advantage of being here in Massachusetts on Cape Cod is this is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. The 3 major elements are organizations from the 1700s that came together eventually in the early 20th century to become the United States Coast Guard, all began here in Massachusetts. The Lighthouse Service, the oldest lighthouse was Boston Light in Boston Harbor. The Revenue Cutter Service, first revenue cutter was the Massachusetts, built up in Newburyport, Mass, and then Homeport in Boston. And the life-saving services origins began with the Massachusetts Humane Society and the first life-saving station produced in the early 1800s, or created in the early 1800s. This is just a quick Coast Guard history 101. It began in a Coast Guard under another name, began as the Revenue Cutter Service on August 4th, 1790. August 4th, I remember because that's now considered the birthplace of the Coast Guard. It was then under the Department of the Treasury. U.S. Life Saving Service was formed as a copy of the Mass Humane Society. That was not officially formed until 150 years ago, this 150th anniversary of the Life Saving Service. And then the Lighthouse Service, although it had origins back to the 1700s, didn't join the Coast Guard until the late 1930s. The name Coast Guard, frankly, only goes back to 1915. Before that time, we were all these other organizations. Also, we've evolved from the Treasury, Department of Transportation in 1967. Then certainly since 9/11, we've been part of Homeland Security. Confusingly, I suspect, this just shows the missions we're involved in right now. They range from search and rescue, obviously law enforcement, to marine environmental protection. I could go on and on. Icebreaking is clearly one of them, but national defense is also one. People don't appreciate that the Coast Guard has participated in every war since 1790. That includes Barbary pilots, the War of 1812, and so forth, all the way up through Coast Guard units and personnel being over in the Middle East right now. We are very closely tied to the Navy and all of our training and so forth. We have a 4-star admiral that serves on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so it's an unusual organization being under the Department of Homeland Security, but also very actively and closely related to the Department of Defense. In fact, we work under the Department of Defense when we're in a war theater of some sort. So, moving on, I like to kid my Coast Guard friends, I have many of them. It's our sister organization, that the Coast Guard is the heart and core around which the Navy forms in time of war. Then they remind me that you have to be over 6 feet to be in a Coast Guard, because if your ship goes down, you want to be able to wade ashore. And we go back and forth. We are the oldest seagoing service in the country. The Navy actually is 8 years younger than us. Seems strange, but there was a Continental Navy, but it was disbanded, and the U.S. Navy didn't form until later in the 1790s. So on that note, just to rub it in one step further, we're talking about iron and steel and ships at this point, and this is old Ironsides, which, as you know, isn't iron at all. It's a wooden ship, but I don't want to carry that too far. I don't want to lose any Navy friends that I have. Before I start tonight's lecture, though, I want to point out, and I congratulate you, Sam. Nice job with this. Your museum, Steel Museum, now has a new exhibit, just introduced an interactive exhibit called Icebreakers, America's Way to the Frozen World. This is just extracted from that. And I'm not going to try to repeat much of this tonight. There's an excellent history of the Coast Guard there and the evolution of icebreaking and so forth. I'm going to add, as I just mentioned, add anecdotes that kind of amplify what you already have online. Icebreaking, there are two different types of icebreaking, I should point out, both of which the Coast Guard is responsible for. It would seem to be, so I should point out that icebreaking is not something used to break social interactions, introductions. These are actually breaking ice. The polar icebreaker breaking, as one would expect, are above or below the Arctic Circle, Antarctic Circle. It's up in the polar regions, and it's a different animal than domestic icebreaking. Domestic icebreaking has been, we've been doing that for, well, in the form of the Coast Guard for over 200 years, helping people out in the ice, helping break out harbors as best we can, with limitations because the ships were not designed to break ice. Polar icebreakers, though, the ones we have now, are clearly designed to break ice, as are most of our current domestic icebreakers. But I'll get into the difference between the two here in a second. In the 1700s and 1800s, early 1800s specifically, most of the harbors in the north, even in the Chesapeake and the Great Lakes, would close down for a couple months a year. The Revenue Cutter Service would actually tie up its ships and send the crews home for January and February typically, because the harbors were frozen over and people, commerce wasn't moving. But as time passed, it was necessary to start moving commerce, particularly as supplies such as coal and oil, need for heating, other supplies, just couldn't continue to shut down the economy for 2 or 3 months. So it was needed to have some way of getting vessels out into the open water and continue commerce. So what happened is, actually, this is sort of humorous in England, and the channels they had, or canals they had there, they had these what were called ice boats. As you can see, it was designed to get in the channels, and they'd have 3 or 4 people get on board and they'd rock the boat back and forth. That little bar in the center was something to grab hold of, and that would allow them to break up the ice. And if they had a little bit of current, that would allow the ice to kind of flow out, and it would get some traffic moving through the channels. Wasn't particularly effective, but all the same, somewhat humorous, I suppose. There is a distant difference between ice breaking and survival, or able to go into ice for exploration, but not necessarily break it out, particularly for the benefit of others. This mostly is related to exploration. As we look for the Northwest Passage over the top of Canada, we're exploring channels and see if we get up there and find ways, hopefully with open water, that we could get through on a better route to go from Europe to the Pacific. That still hasn't proved out very well until just the last few decades, which I'll talk about later. But this is the early use of ice-resistant vessels rather than icebreakers. This Erebus is the Greek for god of darkness, which is an appropriate name because the other ship on this exploration in 1845 was the HMS Terror, appropriately named. They left with 133 people on board and were never heard or seen of again. Their wreck was just recently found within the last decade up north of Canada. They found it up there. Some Inuit people in the late 1840s reported they had seen some of the crew, didn't interact with them much, but they were still alive for a couple of years surviving in the Arctic, but none of them ever got back to civilization. That was typical, and you've heard stories about what happened with Amundsen in the Antarctic. This desire to explore and to enter both of the North and South Pole drove people to take risks that maybe weren't always smart risks. The first true icebreaker actually was in Russia. It was a small, it's called a pilot. It was during our Civil War period. Russia needed icebreakers there to bulk up the harbor. They waited for the ice all to disappear. They would have very little commerce at all. So they developed these, a small boat, but it's recognized as probably the world's first real icebreaker. It was actually steel reinforced icebreaker with a steel hull. And then there's the Fram. Fram was a particularly interesting boat. As an oceanographer, many of the main names of oceanography, such as Nansen, Sverdrup, Amundsen, all were at one point on the Fram. The Fram remained in service for almost 100 years, actually almost 90 years. It was an interesting design in that it could go into the ice and survive. There are many forces that affect a ship in the ice. It's not just the plowing into the ice and breaking through it. Once you get in the ice is moving, unless you're in a very small channel. The ice is being affected by winds and tides, and it's moving out. And there's great pressure on the sides of the ship. In fact, it can crush ships. Even without moving the ship at all, the ship just sitting in the ice can be crushed by the wind driving the ice against the side of the ship. What they come up with this design is the Fram was designed to actually have a very shallow bottom with no keel. And as the ice pushed in, it would actually lift the Fram up, and the Fram would be on top of the ice for a period of time. And then when the ice melted a little bit, it would be able to sink back down again. It was very successful, but it was still a wooden ship. It was probably the strongest. People have suggested it was one, if not the strongest wooden ship ever built. A lot of green heartwood that was added to the hull. They actually did have some plating on the front. I'm not quite sure exactly what it was, some sort of a metal or steel plating that helped out some, but basically the strength of the hull was derived from the woods they used. I'm just checking my note to making sure I'm not missing something significant here, but to be a real effective icebreaker, there are three things that are needed. One is a strengthened hull. Wood was not the best. I just mentioned the Fram worked out fairly well, but having a hull that's strengthened, and iron, steel provided that strength. Since then, there have been other things like in titanium and other things have been used, but having a strengthened hull was one thing. Having a shape that can move the ice. There are two different approaches here. Either you push the ice and split it apart and forced it out, or you actually rode up on the ice and came down to it and crushed it. Both have advantages and disadvantages. But the third thing that was necessary is power. Sailing ships were not good for icebreaking. Once we had power, then icebreaking became more common in both domestic and polar. One of the big things that happened was an Alaska Purchase. Frankly, interestingly, this is a picture of the check for $7.2 million that was paid to buy Alaska from Russia. But it opened up a whole new frontier for us. It brought vessels up into the Arctic, into the Alaska territory. It was like the Wild West up there. The Coast Guard, in this form, it was still called the Revenue Cutter Service, was up there. It was the federal law enforcement agency. There were judge, trial, convictions, all that sort of stuff that would occur aboard Coast Guard vessels up there. They're also doing very heroic rescues, but it required changes in design of revenue cutters to stand up to the ice that they were encountering up in Alaska. So that was the real start of polar icebreaking. And American icebreaking was when we acquired Alaska from Russia. This was a vessel that was up there. It had some reinforcement. They retrofitted it some, but it still wasn't very effective. It could operate in ice and survive. It did survive many cruises up in ice, but it wasn't very effective at breaking ice. These two vessels, the Bear in the front and the Corwin in the back, are, from the Coast Guard Revenue Cutters perspective, very historic. they did some major things, major rescues up in the Alaska. This is both vessels. They were very seldom together, but both vessels off Nome, Alaska, in the late 1800s. They're both revenue cutters. The car one is eventually turned into a commercial vessel, sold off and turned into a commercial vessel. One of the captains here on it was Captain Healy, renowned captain. In fact, you'll see later in this talk, our largest, most recent, largest icebreaker is named after him, the Healy. He was typical wild and crazy, had a problem with alcohol, but he was the right person, the right place, at the right time. Turned out that he was African-American. Turned out, but just no one knew he was African, very light skinned, but he was African-American. He was the first African-American ever to command a US government vessel. Frankly, somewhat by accident, because people didn't know he was African-American, but he still is. And we're proud of the fact that we were the first to have an African-American as one of our captains. This is the Seneca. Seneca is a derelict destroyer. I've got to put my emphasis right there. It wasn't a destroyer that was derelict. It was a destroyer that went after derelict vessels. It was one of a kind, built to destroy derelicts. It was a big problem in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There'd be ships out there that had been abandoned or floating around. It almost became, it set the standard for other countries to do it. Very few others did it. Turned out that, but later in the early 20th century, it became less of a problem. But it was the first vessel to appear on the International Ice Patrol. International Ice Patrol was formed in 1912, weeks after the Titanic went down. It was in response to the Titanic. It went down obviously in the Grand Banks. The Navy sent a couple of ships up there to patrol it until the icebergs dispersed for the year in 1912. And in 1913, 1914, the Revenue Cutter Service took it over. This being the Seneca, being a revenue cutter up there. And probably this picture is from 1914. Not being a derelict destroyer here, being an ice patrol cutter, tracking icebergs and warning ships coming across the Atlantic. By the way, this service still exists today, International Ice Patrol. I spent 3 years as a deputy commander of the Ice Patrol and also as their oceanographer. And proud of the fact that no other ship since the Titanic has sunk in transatlantic traffic from hitting an iceberg, just because of the warning systems that we've been putting out since 1912. Just going to take a second here to get back on track with my notes. This is the West Wind, one of the wind class icebreakers that were built for the Navy and the Coast Guard both in 1940s during World War I. Eventually, they all became part of the Coast Guard, but they were part of the Navy for a while. In fact, right after the war, through Lend-Lease, 2 or 3 of them were turned over to the Russians, and the Russians had it. Interestingly, when we've gone aboard some of these vessels, I was on the South one, we were able to go down and look and see that there was writing in Russian in a lot of these, because they were in Russia for 4 or 5 years before they were turned back to the United States government. So I'm doing very well with my notes here, but I can talk freely of this. This is a domestic icebreaking again. The purpose there was strictly to open up passageways for commerce to keep moving during the wintertime. This was not just northern New England and other very cold regions, but included Chesapeake Bay. Even in 1977, we had vessels down in Chesapeake Bay breaking the ice. It was a particularly tough, cold winter to keep commerce moving. It's also important to have these vessels for search and rescue, because people go out and do stupid things and they need to be rescued in the ice. I said icebreaking is not necessarily, domestic icebreaking is not necessarily new to the Coast Guard or revenue cutters. Even back in the 1790s, if a vessel was in distress, the revenue cutters would go out and assist. If it was in the wintertime, they could do some limited breaking around the ice, or at least to get into it, survive in the ice, and maybe rescue people and so forth. But even more recently, I think hopefully many of you have had a chance to see the film The Finest Hours. Came out a few years ago about a Coast Guard rescue off of Chatham in 1952. This was a Disney film starring Chris Pine and Casey Affleck, I guess, were the 2 stars in it. but it talks about a rescue off of Chatham. And the boat that was used was the 36-500, shown here. Still exists, still in good shape. It's a historic vessel in Rock Harbor in Orleans on the Cape. But the point here is, if you look at this, the hull, it is metal clad at the bottom, at the waterline and down, because during the wintertime, it would break vessels out in Chatham Harbor, go around to fishing vessels that were stuck at the pier and just work carefully around them and break the ice and allow them to get back underway. It wasn't a heavy icebreaker, but it could maneuver and survive on ice, and also could do rescues if necessary to go out in the ice and survive. I mentioned before that I've been on the Great Lakes and in the Arctic with icebreaking, but I've had actually three icebreakers that have worked for me in my different jobs. One up in Portland, the Thunder Bay 140-foot icebreaker, fairly new, relatively new, was built in the 70s. Whereas the pendant I had when I was in Group Boston, I also had the shackle when I was up in Portland, but the pendant was built in 1961, quite a bit older. But these were all domestic icebreakers. They never got to and never intended to get to the Arctic, but they'd be working in, well, for example, Thunder Bay did most of its work on the coast of Maine, breaking ice there and keeping oil going in was a primary thing up into some of the harbors to resupply, make sure they had plenty of oil for the winter. This icebreaker I spent some time on back in the 60s, it turned out. I was a cadet at the Coast Guard Academy at the time. We did a long summer cruise on this. It's the Mackinaw that was built in near the end of World War II, I'm sorry, to open up the Great Lakes for commerce to move in support of wartime efforts in the Great Lakes. Interestingly, it was built as a want to make sure that it was remained a fresh water. Some of the legislation that went in at that time, Congress, they were concerned if they provided money, particularly the states, Michigan, others around the Great Lakes, they build this icebreaker and the Coast Guard would take it out of the Great Lakes and use it somewhere else. So they built it 74 feet 3 inches wide at the beam. That was too wide to get out of the Great Lakes. The St. Lawrence Seaway was narrow enough. I think it had to be 70 feet or under to be able to get out of the Great Lakes. So it also had other things on board. It wasn't really designed to operate in salt water. A lot of the piping on board and so forth didn't make it ideal for that. Fortunately, though, in 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway was widened to 78 feet. So when I was on board this in 1967, we were the first, it was the first time the Mackinaw actually was able to get out of the Great Lakes. Not very far out. We went up to Montreal and came back on the Great Lakes, but I remember going through the locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we literally had, it appeared to be inches, but looks like a foot or both on both sides, very tight fit, but this could get out. So this served until this was considered, they called it the Queen of the Great Lakes. It was an icebreaker helping traffic move around the Great Lakes during wintertime. Then it was used for ace navigation and so forth, but during the summertime. But it was getting old. It's now a museum in Sheboygan. The Mackinaw was replaced by the Mackinaw. The vessel you see in the lower right is the new Mackinaw that came in 2006. It's a little bit smaller, equally powerful, just a little bit shorter, and more versatile. You can see it has booms there designed to handle ace navigation, buoys, that sort of thing. So it was more multi-mission, more capable of doing productive things during the summertime, which the Mackinaw wasn't as much, didn't have the capability of doing all the different missions the Coast Guard performs as much as the new Mackinaw, which is now currently operating in the Great Lakes and will remain there indefinitely. There's no intention of moving it out of the Great Lakes. It's also in Sheboygan, so they have both of them, both these vessels home port of the same place. The original Mackinaw, it's not called 1 and 2, but we'll call it Mackinaw 1 is right there close by the new Mackinaw, its replacement. So that's icebreaking in domestic, but then there's polar. Polar icebreaking really didn't get going. The icebreaking, getting vessels up and to resupply areas of the Arctic, didn't really get going until late 30s and 40s. These icebreakers, the wind class, were produced. They're 290 feet long. They were produced, as I said before, in World War II. And they got involved very much during World War II with the Greenland Patrol and helping out. There were a lot of resources up in Greenland, and there were concerns about it was Danish owned at that point. There was concern about the Germans taking over Denmark and having access to these rich materials that were needed for war. So icebreakers were up there. Coast Guard got involved there. Eventually, the Coast Guard. I should take one step back. All this stuff up until the 1930s was done because it was the right thing to do by the Coast Guard. Search and rescue, doing icebreaking. 1936, though, Franklin finally signed an executive order, and Congress also enforced it, saying, Coast Guard, you are now responsible for domestic icebreaking. You need to keep commerce moving. So that brought a little bit more money in for some of the domestic icebreakers. In it wasn't until 1965 that Congress finally said, Coast Guard, you are now the lead agency to run all the icebreakers in the United States. So a few that were still left of the Navy were transferred back to the Coast Guard in 1965. That was about the time I was entering the Coast Guard. The Manhattan Project occurred when I was up in Greenland in 1969. We were supposed to escort the Manhattan across, but it got delayed for several reasons. It finally made the trip later in the summer in 1969. At that point, I had to go back for classes at the academy. But as some of you may know, the reinforcement, Manhattan was the largest oil tanker the United States had at the time. It wasn't built as an icebreaker, but just before 1969, they reinforced the hull with steel primarily from, wasn't it, Jim, primarily from Lufkin? I believe that was the case.
Yes, that's Lugan steel.
Yep. So it was reinforced. It was escorted across by two wind-class icebreakers across in 1969, completed the journey from east to west across the Northwest Passage. It did it twice, actually. Had some damage done to it. There was some holes punched in the side, nothing serious. They weren't carrying oil at the time. They're just experimenting. Those were all repaired. It never really became a regular route, though. Unfortunately, I suppose, or fortunately, that's changing. These icebreakers were built in the 1970s. Was the Polar Sea and Polar Star. They were the largest conventionally powered icebreakers, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. Russians still had larger icebreakers that were nuclear powered, but these two were built and they were very, very effective. Their power, they had significant power. I'll show you a video here in a second, but they were amazing resources for us. Unfortunately, after 30 years or so, they started to develop problems. The polar, again, I said it was a Polar Star and a Polar Sea. The Polar Sea had some mechanical difficulty. In the end, 5 of their 6 main engines, diesel engines, they still had turbo engines too, but diesel engines failed or had some major mechanical problems with it. And the Coast Guard tried to get funding from Congress to do the repair, and Congress said no. So right now, and for the last 10 years, the Polar Sea has been used as a scrap, as a parts supply for the Polar Star. They've been taking parts off it and just using it. So it's floating in Seattle as a spare parts ship, sadly, because we need icebreakers desperately. Let me show this video here, and hopefully this will work. Amazing resource that and still is important. The Polar Star is still very effective and performing well, but it is getting quite old. It is approaching 50 years of age at this point, 45 years old, and needs to be replaced. The Healy, I mentioned Captain Healy before, sort of the rough and tumble captain in the Alaska in the late 1800s. This is named after him. It's our largest ship, the Coast Guard, 420 feet long. It's a little less powerful than a Polar Star. So although it's bigger, it can't handle quite as much ice. The Polar Star, by the way, said 10 feet. When it's ramming and riding up on ice, it can get through ice that's as much as 15 feet thick. If you notice in that video, you can see it actually riding up on the ice and coming down and crushing the ice. But The Healy is still very active at this point. I'll get to it more in a second, but let me show this again, a very short video, similar to what I showed before, but more about the Healy. The problem now is we are down to 2 polar icebreakers. The Russians have 46 significant icebreakers. The Chinese is building them. We have proposed now building this, and the contract is led on it. Hopefully the first one will be out in 2024. It is, again, larger than the Healy at 460 feet, a lot of power. It's called instead of an icebreaker, Coast Guard is calling it the Polar Security Class. And for a good reason. The issue is to get a presence in the Arctic, to show that, show the flag up there, show that we have, we're a force around the world, a naval force, because not only the Russians up there, but the Chinese now are building icebreakers. Let me just show you a couple of them. Certainly the Canadians have about 7 or 8 icebreakers, and some pretty good size, large, not as large as the Healy. This is a Chinese icebreaker that is in existence now. This is one that's planned, very large, again, similar in size or larger than the ones we've just been talking about. This is the largest icebreaker in the world, 524 feet. It's Russian, nuclear powered. They have 7 nuclear powered icebreakers. This is one proposed, this behemoth, proposed to be built, much larger than you saw the Euro. It's the leader class. It's the first of the class, 600 plus feet, 620, still in the design stage. Won't be out for another 5 years or so, but it's going to provide a significant presence in the Arctic. And then there's the Healy. This is a picture of the Healy just a few weeks ago. It's going around Barrow. It's trying to do a circumnavigation of, and it will succeed in doing that, clearly. It's going to do a circumnavigation of the North America. It's showing the flag up there again, showing the world that we're still a strength and so forth, but it's a little shallow because we only have two icebreakers right now, the Healy and the Polar Star. We're looking for more. The Commandant Coast Guard has said that we absolutely need to be up in the Arctic and down the Antarctic on a more persistent basis than we are today. Great power competitions alive and well. We need to be part of that great power competition and participate in it. The polar security class breakers, though, are not coming cheap. They're $750 million each. $1.9 trillion has been budgeted to build 3 of them. All 3 will be out hopefully by 2026. But as we have global warming and have the ice melt, it's going to be a stronger presence up there. For one of the first times in history, I've said that the Coast Guard and the Revenue Cutter Service, except back in the 1700s, the Coast Guard has had a support role in most battles, similar to the Navy, unless it's a naval battle offshore. The Marines are the tip of the spear. This is one of the first times where the Coast Guard is going to be the tip of the spear up in the Arctic. While we're up there, the crew on board is going to be Coast Guard with probably a detachment of 10 or 12 Navy people on board with special weapons trainings and so forth that will help out. The Coast Guard has gunner's mates, understands, but some of this may be fairly sophisticated weapons. Again, it's a show of force. Hopefully not an intention to ever use that. That's always the goal, is not to use it. But the Chinese certainly are trying to take a more aggressive. At least the Russians have a presence there, as do the Denmark and Canada and the U.S. with Alaska. But China doesn't even have a presence in the Arctic as far as shoreline, but it wants to show itself. He wants that presence in the Arctic. Now, I've skipped through a lot of this, and I didn't talk much. I have more on steel plenty, but it seems dangerous for me to get into that since my knowledge of it. It is it's a compromise. I'll say one more thing about the design of icebreakers. There's a compromise between minimum ice resistance, maneuverability. For example, maneuverability, you want it narrow enough so it can follow leads and get around in the ice, and low friction. In some cases, they've actually used explosion welded abrasive resistant stainless steel at the water line to cut down friction and to provide some additional protection. Icebreaker steel has been traditionally up to 2 inches thick. and double hulled. I will point out that in the Arctic, when I was there, I'm trying to think of which trip it was. It could have been the trip in the 60s, 69. We were looking for the sill at the head of a fjord with glaciers coming out. The sill kind of defines the depth of the sill, defines how large the icebergs will be coming out of that fjord. Unfortunately, we found the sill. It wasn't really a sill, though. It was an uncharted rock, and we went hard aground. We were going pretty good speed at the time. And the only major disaster we had on board, all double hulled, is we punctured a hole in a hull and into one of the compartments on board that carried all the ship's toilet paper. That was tough to live through that, but we did survive. We had resupplied toilet paper, but for a couple of weeks, as you know, there aren't many trees in Greenland, so we couldn't use leaves. Use letters from home, I guess, for a while. If you have any questions, I'd like to open it up now. If people have any questions or any things, again, I applaud Sam if he's still around there for what he's done. I had more that I was going to discuss here, and it's fine because it's all online. I just don't want to repeat what's there. People really want some deep knowledge of icebreaking and the history of it and the sequencing of it. Take a look at the museum's website and a new exhibit they have on virtually online. We're doing more with our exhibits too online with Icebreaking and International Ice Patrol, and also have an exhibit coming up next year the same way. I will end, at least before I take any questions, if there are any, to invite anyone up. We are particularly proud of the museum. I see that Phil Dolan is here from our museum on this session. Phil is one of our docents and also was a Coast Guard officer. But we're very proud of what the museum has become and the changing exhibits we have and so forth. So if you have reason to come up to the Cape, and it's a nice place to visit. It was a beautiful day today, mid-70s, sunny. So anyway, Jim, I'll turn it back to you. See if there are any questions.
Well, just wanted to repeat, please unmute your microphone, and then you can proceed to ask Greg some questions interactively. It's not the old-fashioned way where you raise your hand, although you can do that. If it gets disorderly, we'll ask you to raise your hand. However, if we kind of proceed with any questions you may have, please fire away.
I don't mean to turn this into a global aggressive action against the different nations, but clearly China and Russia are our concerns, and we're weak right now in the Arctic. The Navy doesn't have the ability to get into the Arctic. They can get up there with submarines underwater, but that's about it. We have the polar power. As Admiral Schultz, our commandant, suggested just a short time ago, he said that Russia has at least 40 heavy icebreakers, including 6 that are nuclear powered right now. I thought it was 7, but 6, he said. There are a couple more coming online that are nuclear powered. And intends to use the Northern Sea routes through the Arctic as essential economic toll roads, concerned about both Russia and China having a position up there and blocking traffic going through. Sad thing is that we are melting the ice cap. Good news is it's opening up new routes, and we need to have a presence up there. So finally, I think Congress is seeing that and appreciating that, and the Department of Defense has always seen that, and we may have some resources now to put up there and protect our interest. I may have done such a good job, there's no other questions. But just trying to see what I didn't cover here. It's interesting to see the new icebreaker, the Polar class, the 460 foot. I've been trying to talk with them. They're out straight now down in Pascagoula is where they're being made, Pascagoula, Mississippi. And the keel hasn't yet been laid, at least as of several weeks ago. It may have been now, but 2 years now, 2.5 years now, the first one is supposed to come out. So they've got a lot of work to do. It's a major project. As you can imagine, the price tag, when Phil and I were active in the Coast Guard in our early years, $750 million was the entire budget for the Coast Guard. Now this is what they're paying for one ship. little disconcerting, but I think it's absolutely necessary. The ones that the Chinese are building right now are in excess of $2 billion for them. Not that we have to spend dollar for dollar, but Arctic is filled with natural resources that also need to be protected beyond just the route going over, including, as you're well aware, oil, but there's more up there than that.
Well, I see we have a question from Ellen Enslow in the chat room. Ellen's from the Chester County Historic Center, formerly Historical Society. Her question is, when Lukens produces steel for ice cutters, for example, how is that shipped to the dockyard? It's shipped out, plate is shipped out of Coatesville in two ways, mostly by flatbed truck, but often, as in the case of the steel for the World Trade Center, by train. The Norfolk Southern comes in daily with scrap and leaves with plate. So depending on the size and weight of the plate, it would either go out by rail or by truck.
Jim, if I can pose a question for you, that I asked earlier on, do you have any access for us? We're very interested. It's nothing to do with ships, but our building that Phil and I are in, that building in 1856 was built from cast iron. We're pretty sure it was from Pennsylvania. Do you have any resource to have us track that down somehow? Is there any easy way to track down where it may have come from? It was a major development because they're building many of these all over the country. And it was cast iron.
Yeah, from the 1850s, Greg, I'm not sure. The bulk of our collection is at the Hagley Museum. It could reside there, and the reason it's a Hagley is because it's very accessible to researchers. It's a huge collection of Lucan steel records, excluding their personnel records, but certainly their products and process. So we can certainly take a peek with our friends at Hagley and answer that question.
Okay, good. I mean, it's just a nice thing when we're taking people around that talk about the whole idea of the cast iron, everything, the shutters on the building, the stairs, the spindles on the stairs are all cast iron, meant to be fireproof, but also some other very interesting architectural features on it.
This is Rich Smith. Lukens never made cast iron structures. Phoenix Steel in Phoenixville made a lot of cast iron parts for bridges and balustrades and posts. So some of it may have come from Phoenixville, but not from Coatesville.
Okay, good. Well, I've been trying to get closer. We really haven't put a lot of effort into where it came. We know that it was stockpiled by Ami Young, who was the architect. He was also the major architect for the Department for Treasury at the time. He was the lead architect, and it was almost like a large warehouse in some cases where stuff was taken off the shelves, stairways and window frames and so forth. But the structures were produced somewhere, and my understanding was Pennsylvania somewhere. So I'll have to work a little longer to find out.
Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? If you think of something, please email us at steelmuseum.org. We always say, if we don't know, we say, I don't know. But if we can research it, we have an iron and steel roundtable, which consists of Rich Smith, among others. And we can get you an answer, or at least point you in the right direction. So please don't hesitate to use that resource in the future, even on other questions.
Well, Jim, I should say I appreciate the fact that you allowed me to really brush up on my icebreaker experience here. And I'll say one more time to Sam, I read over what you had, and good job in that. I didn't see, I had a couple small errors. I'll get back to you on that. Very, very minor, basically almost typos, I think, but nothing significant in a website. That's nice to see. Thanks for your work. Well, good. The Red Sox are playing the Tampa Bay Rays at 8 o'clock tonight, and my wife, to say the least, is a Red Sox fanatic, so I have to go join her at some point.
Greg, I might just add one little thing to you. You did a great job. I appreciate, I learned a lot myself, but in 1960, the winter of 1960-61, I was an officer on the 125-footer General Green out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. And that was a very severe winter. And I remember the Vineyard Sound freezing over all the way from Buzzards Bay out to the Apollocrip Lightship. And as the tide would go out, all of that ice would slide from east to from west to east, and when the tide came in, it would slide the other way. And so that was quite an interesting winter. And we broke ice on the with our little 125-footer to keep Gloucester Harbor open.
Yeah, it's amazing. Obviously, with all the warmth coming out from major metropolitan areas now, you don't see Boston Harbor or New York Harbor freezing over anymore, but they used to. And there are all sorts of diseases. I said the Revenue Cutter Service didn't go out in certainly the late 1700s and early 1800s, and some of the more northern ports would even tie up the ship and just leave them there for a couple of months and come back in the spring and kind of break the ship out. But there are ships such as light ships that are out there 12 months of the year, 24/7. Out in a particularly tragic one was in Long Island. It was in Nantucket Sound. The captain of the ship caught in ice out there. They were there anchored, caught in ice, was able to walk ashore and call. Somehow was able to get in contact with the district office. This is at that point the U.S. Lighthouse Service office in Boston, and said, "We're in desperate trouble here. Once this ice breaks up, there's a chance we may lose the ship." And they kind of did the macho thing, saying, "Go out if you can survive. It's not our tradition to have you to leave. Our record is always have the light ships out there for navigation." Well, it turned out in the spring when the ice melted, they were torn off and lost all the crew of I think 8 or 12 people on board. Now I gave that example in Chesapeake Bay just only 40 years ago, where much of Chesapeake Bay froze over. But with the warming of our planet recently, that's happening less and less. But it just opens up areas that we want to penetrate in even more, and that primarily is the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it for you coming, and for the audience, for you attending. Appreciate the education we received tonight, and look forward to our next talk. It's in November. We have some folks from the Sun Shipbuilding Company to give a presentation. Of course, those who have visited the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum know that we have the Guppy, which is a submersible, shallow dive submersible made by Sun Ship out of Lucan Steel to inspect Sun oil rigs. We had some visitors a month ago come. One guy was from Sun Oil, one was from Sun Ship. The gent from Sun Ship came back with 2 other guys from Sun Ship, and they're going to give a presentation in early November. So we look forward to that. Other than that, thank you all for coming. Take good care and have the good rest of your evening.
Thank you.